Hey everyone, National Master Sean Lei here, and in today's opening video, I'll be giving you a brief overview of one of my openings that I played to help me get to the National Master before I switched over to the Philidor, the Sicilian Defense, and more specifically, the Najdorf Defense. All of that coming straight up. So, you might be wondering, Sean, isn't this opening very complex? And didn't you tell us that you didn't like playing complex openings? And the answer is yes, this is a very complex opening. However, there are some basic structures you can learn if you want to progress to a high enough level. Now, am I saying that this opening is better than the Philidor defense? Technically, at the highest level, yes. However, to play this optimally, it's much harder than the Philidor defense, so I urge you, if you want to play a simple, not so complex opening, check out my Philidor series. But if you want to play a fighting, aggressive opening, then I urge you to play this defense as well. And so, I'm going to try to, well, dumb down and basically explain the basic structures in today's video, and in future videos I might be, talking about more specific ideas that you can be going for. But then again, because this opening is so complex, there are so many different ideas that your opponent can go for. So today, we're going to be going over the basic structure in the open Sicilian. So in this position over here, after knight c3, you play pawn a6. And after pawn a6, this is what we call it the Najdorf defense. And so your opponent has a lot of different things they can play, but there are two main variations your opponent can go for. One I call the boring variation, basically your opponent basically does nothing, and the other one is the super aggressive Yugoslav attack, or the English attack I believe it's called in the Najdorf. Yep, it's called the English attack. So bishop e3. Now we'll go over bishop e3 in the future, however right now I just want to go over the basic overview of bishop e2 lines because this is the line that most people play. They might play bishop e2, they might play h4, they might play bishop d3, bishop c4. All of these lead to the same structure, and I want you guys to try to remember the basic ideas and patterns and where you put your pieces. So here, what I like to do is I like to play e5. Now there is variations like the pawn e6, the classical variations, but these are very complex, so I don't urge you guys to do it. So I'm going to tell you to play pawn e5, and in this position usually the knight goes to b3. However, if it goes to knight f3, really not much has changed, just play the same thing. After this, I urge you guys to just develop your bishop to e6. Kind of makes sense. I mean, where else would the bishop go? The king castles. Doesn't matter really much what he does. You can just play bishop e7, and let's say they play bishop e3, and we can castle. And so in the Najdorf, you really have two places that you can put the knight. So let's say our opponent just plays something like queen d2. We can put it on c6, or we can put it on d7. Personally, I prefer the d7 square. Why do I like d7? Well, it supports this knight over here, and if my opponent wants to exchange it, I can capture back over here. And like most openings, one of our basic plans in these positions, once we have all our pieces developed, where we can have like a rook here, queen there, and rook there, is we want to go for one of the two pawn breaks that are in any given position. And like the Philidor defense, the basic pawn breaks are quite simple. You're trying to go for d5, and if your opponent lets you because he's a silly guy, all of a sudden you have a great advantage. Now I'm not going to say White's going to play a silly move like this, but in a position like this, it's possible you can play pawn d5. And I'm going to be showing you why this pawn d5 idea is so strong and so important in these variations. And the reason why is because once your opponent captures all of these pieces, guess who has the center pawns? And if you guys know me, I love my center pawns because it gives you space in the center, and from your space in the center, you can gain pretty good advantages. Especially since the c pawn is weak, you can go for minority attacks and try to take advantage of their weak pawns. So d5 is of course one of the plans we want to go for, but if our opponent's good, they might try to block it, right? Like this is so annoying. We don't want to deal with any of this. We can't play d5 because that's just a free pawn. And now you might be thinking, okay Sean, so if d5 is not possible, what's the other pawn move we can play in order to basically try to get a grip on the center? And if you have watched my previous videos, you guys know what move it is. It's pawn b5. What is pawn b5 trying to do? In simple terms, we're just trying to play b4 to boot the knight so we can take this pawn and get d5 in. Let's say our opponent's silly. Let's say he plays a4. We can kick the knight. Let's say he moves away. You can take here, and sure, he might be able to take this pawn, but one thing you will notice in the future is that these pawns are not very good for our opponent to capture because we always have moves like d5, and we have two center pawns against 0. We can even push this pawn over here. We have a great advantage. We have 2 open files to take advantage of from our opponents, and we're just basically having a jolly good time. And so this is the basic idea of what you want to do. If you get d5 early, play d5. You equalize immediately, if not, even get better. If you can't play d5, you just play pawn b5. Now, you might be thinking, Sean, what if your opponent plays a4 and you can't play either d5 or b5? Now, this is where the actual chess game begins, and this is where things get a little bit more complex, and why this opening is very complex, even though this is one of the simpler variations. Now, you have a couple ideas. I recommend to you guys, just develop your pieces, right? Just develop your pieces here and see what your opponent does. Let's say he plays rook d1 because he's trying to stop d5. Let's put him over here. Now, if he plays here ever, this is not really a good idea. You always just capture with the bishop, and after this you can play knight e8, f5, f4, maybe g5, g4, go for some King's Indian setups, and your opponent's queenside attack isn't really going anywhere, so you're not really scared of these ideas. And so, because of this, well, this is the basic structure. You just develop here, and potentially you can just get d5 in the future if your opponent lets up, and if not, you're just going to try to maneuver your pieces in a way that can help you play d5 in the future. Potentially you can play knight f8, knight g6, so your rook can see d5. Maybe you want to play pawn b6. Maybe you want to put the knight on c5, so he captures and you can capture back, so your backwards d-pawn is not a problem. And so a lot of people, they don't really like playing the Najdorf, especially if they're a beginner, because, well, the d6 pawn is a weakness, right? It is a backwards pawn, but again, think of the potential of this pawn. If we get d5, this pawn is no longer a problem, but if your opponent gets to restrict it, then they will have the advantage. Alright guys, so again, let's take it from the top. Let's make sure we understand what we want to do. If you guys are watching this video live, which I assume you guys are, I recommend you guys just go with me. Imagine what you would play here as black. Now here, c5, pawn d6, pawn d4, captures, knight f6, knight c3, the basic setup over here. And in this position, you play pawn a6. In the future, I might explain the pawn g6 variation, the dragon, as that is much better for beginner/intermediate players who are first beginning, because you have a stronger bishop. But as you get better and better, it gets worse and worse, because your opponents might have counters like the Yugoslav attack, which is very deadly. And so after a6, your opponent really could do anything. It's just called the boring variation. And the boring variation is just any variation your opponent's not trying to castle queenside. And so after this, doesn't matter, knight f3, knight b3, you just develop your pieces in this manner. And if your opponent messes up and lets you play pawn d5, you can play pawn d5. Like in this position, you can play pawn d5, it just equalizes. However, I like to build up against my opponent. So let's say he goes something like this. Knight bd7 again, knight c6 okay. I like knight bd7 better because it protects my knight. And so let's say they play a4 because they're trying to stop b5. In fact, one thing I want to mention is you don't want to play b5 too early. You might be thinking, haha, I got a steal here, I get b5 early. The thing is, this might become a weakness if your opponent can take advantage of it early, especially if you don't have development. So you don't want to play b5 too early unless you know that you can take advantage of your opponent's knights. And so after this position, knight bd7, doesn't really matter what our opponent plays. We can play rook c8, get this file. They play a4, queen c7. Say they play rook c1 and we can play rook d8. And from here, the world really is our oyster. We can really play whatever we want. We can try knight c5 ideas, trying to attack e4. We might play knight f8, knight here, trying to play pawn d5. We can play queen c6. And there's so many ideas in this opening, which makes it a lot more complicated than like the Philidor defense, but it is an opening that is stronger in the proper hands and with the person using the right tools. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's basic overview of the boring variation in the Sicilian defense. And if you want to try out the Najdorf, one of the most popular, if not the best opening at the highest level, if you want to play for winning chances as black, I do recommend this opening for you guys. Now, if you guys enjoyed today's video, I do recommend you guys to press that subscribe button and like for more educational chess content like this one. I'll see you guys in the next video.